To dominate Africa and Africans was the sole motive, the main goal. The historic conference held in Berlin, 1884 to 85, says it all. They had taken advantage of a simple people's ignorance, picked on the greedy ones amongst the locals to manipulate with meager things, like guns, clothes, metals, and so on. Things that don't count, things meant to bring nothing but destruction and more divisiveness on the African continent and its people. The raiding of towns when black locals were in deep slumber was a white culture. And captured they were, brutally subjected to the shackles, stripped of their names, their families, dwellings, and all. The unspeakably gruesome tales of life aboard slave ships says it all. Inhumanity, barbarity, and cruelty would become law, so that the black man and woman and children would have nowhere to hide or run. The oppression was, until now, legitimate to the very letter, so that white children grew up not knowing whether blacks were fellow human beings, but saw them only as mere properties of exploitation, like the cattle, the camel, or the horse, feeling no affection towards them. But even animals, the beasts of the fields, need affection to thrive. In the cold, wicked hands of their captors, they had become acquiesced to the unending dehumanization, thus would remain that way for generations. This was all procedure to becoming a new kind of a breed of people. This was the turning point of lives, from free soils to slaves, in body and in thought. In body, as their flesh and bones suffered severe wounds of extreme mistreatments. In thought, as their minds suffered severe denial of the least knowledge, spoon-fed with disinformation all throughout their years. Nobody would save the black man, woman, boy, or girl from the hands of the laws, federal laws, upheld by a federation to dehumanize, oppress, and deny them as a way of governance. Their ailing body and mind would run empty for the longest time, ailing for recognition, equality, restitution, and absolute liberation from all they have been denied, alienated from their original families and nationalities, lands in their mass taken from them and leaving them entirely dispossessed, cities painstakingly built, which were burnt down, while others were drowned in their numbers, leaving them entirely displaced, brutal lynchings of family members lurking in their memories. The list could just go on and on without stop. This brings us to the question of generational trauma in the DNAs of the collective blacks in diaspora, whose direct and indirect ancestors have been put through so much unspeakable inhumanity for centuries. Fast forward to this very day and time, and one could tell plainly that there's been only very little difference from the past. The bedevilment would not come to an end. Rather, it has taken a new dimension in this modern world. In this video, we confront the uncomfortable truth.
This mob of over 100 people marched on an African American's house in October of 1909.
Of white sabotage.
These are not the kind of people who want to be involved in mob violence. And they don't have to, because they have other tools that they can use.
Against black communities, we will be examining the pitfalls.
The predominant response of the United States government and state and local governments to the Great Migration was to contain black people in their own neighborhoods.
From housing segregation,
introduced and encouraged racially restrictive covenants, redlining,
to redlining
of every major city where African Americans landed. The federal government was a sponsor of urban renewal, infamously called Negro removal.
And there's this tool that they become aware of. It's called a racial covenant.
To racial covenants.
And the federal government writ large, in the first 7 decades of the 20th century, invested billions of dollars in racial segregation and concentrated poverty.
To the concentrated poverty of black families.
Each time this country created a peculiar institution that subordinated black people, slavery, Jim Crow, it created and dismantled it. They replaced it with another one.
The same people who own the labels own the prisons.
Literally the same people?
Literally the same people who own the labels own private prisons. The record company pushing the narrative. You know, some social engineering going on here to make sure those prisons stay full.
And to social engineering of black youths in the Americas, do kindly to hit the thumb button, share with friends and families to keep spreading our eye-opening black narrative, and subscribe to stay with us for more revealing contents. Without further ado, let us delve in. Inequality between white and black Americans persists in almost every aspect of society and the economy. Such disadvantages have proven immune to decades of laws and policies meant to address them, leaving black people with less education, poorer health, and shorter lifespans. Together, the disparities reflect what many have labeled systemic racism. In 1962, Fannie Lou Hamer, a leader of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, was fired from her job after she campaigned to encourage African Americans to vote. 2 years later, when Hamer testified at the DNC in support of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, specifically its efforts to further black voter registration, President Lyndon B. Johnson called an impromptu news conference to make it impossible for national television networks to cover her testimony live. This type of silencing, used generation after generation against marginalized voices, is nothing new. For decades, it has ensured America never had to face a hard truth, that its foundations, its very roots, are racist. And today, threats like doxing, reporting of work, and white gatekeeping are common tactics used to silence those who speak that truth. It happened to the black men who took a knee at their NFL games to protest the killing of black bodies at the hands of the police force. It happens to Black Lives Matter activists who are censored by social media algorithms that protect white men. It happens to women of color, representatives in our own government. In 2018, during the Senate Intelligence Committee hearing with Jeff Sessions, Senator Kamala Harris was the only senator to be reprimanded by her male colleagues for asking pertinent questions, like whether Sessions had any communication with Russians. Silencing happens when, for white people, hearing the truth is too much, when the truth hangs so painfully heavy on their shoulders that they'd rather get rid of the weight than actually face the issue head on, author Alice Walker says.
We will be ourselves and free, or die in the attempt. Harriet Tubman was not our great-grandmother for nothing. There is still so much more work to do. I am committed to continue doing what I can, with what I have, from where I'm at. We can't back down. We can't be silent. We must all stand, committed to do the work.
On November 9, 2016, CNN commentator Van Jones described Donald Trump's nearly solidified victory to become president of the United States as a white lash.
This was a white lash. This was a white lash against a changing country. It was a white lash against a black president in part. And that's the part where the pain comes.
He said,
White lash is a unique and poignant word. It signifies a definite and determinate action in retaliation for the mobility of blackness that is an assertion of white supremacy. There are clear and distinct racial underpinnings that give voice to some of the reasons behind Trump's election, and also prove that this is not the first example of a white lash in American history.
if we think about how and why white lashes happen, we must begin with the invention of white supremacy, an ideology and structure that views white people as a dominant superior race. This ideology was used to mobilize, justify, and create racialized slavery, which was used in the United States, with origins stemming from European colonizers, including the Portuguese, English, French, and Spanish. The concept of white supremacy was legitimized during the 18th century through pseudoscience that sought to prove the inherent inferiority of black genetics. And while race is a social construct and pigmentation is genetically insignificant, such scientific findings were normalized in the public arena and installed in America. While the Emancipation Proclamation of 1863 and the ratification of the 13th Amendment in 1865 sought to abolish legal slavery, the racist architecture and legacy of slavery could not be wiped clean. One of America's first white lashes then was the Jim Crow period that came in reaction to the period of Reconstruction. Reconstruction took place from 1865 to 1877 and was marked by prosperity among many African Americans. 16 African Americans served in Congress, and over 600 African Americans were elected to state legislatures. However, the end of Reconstruction was marked by the withdrawal of Union troops from the southern states, and white supremacy took hold again. The Ku Klux Klan resurged, and the 13th Amendment was being regularly exercised to enact convict leasing, a practice of leasing prisoners to do cheap or unpaid labor for private or public organizations, greatly resembling racialized slavery. Lynchings were happening with regularity, and segregation by law and by fact came into being. The next white lash came at the onset of the civil rights and black liberation movement of the 1950s, 1960s, and 1970s, when an intense and significant mobilization of black people saw an equally intense backlash. Published in 1975 and 1976, the Senate Commission Church Committee reports revealed the extensive surveillance, conspiracy, and sabotage that was carried out by the government, the FBI, and allied powers against domestic anti-racist and anti-war activist groups. Programs like COINTELPRO included illegal surveillance that was often manifested in violence against groups like the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, helmed by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense. The reports detail rampant wiretapping, fabrication of evidence, media agenda setting, infiltration via informants, and even assassination, like that of Fred Hampton. So while the civil rights movement is often romantically remembered, the swelling of black agency and political involvement was actively sabotaged and widely condemned. Following the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, American legislatures are supposed to guarantee the right to vote for black people. But with the advent of political agency of black people in America came an equal and opposite reaction in the form of gerrymandering, which is the practice of drawing districts by political parties to favor voting outcomes or enforce segregation. Gerrymandering was coupled with institutional housing discrimination implemented by President Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal, which was passed during the 1930s in reaction to the Great Depression, and also led to the maintenance of school segregation, which experts say persists to this day. Another major white lash that is well documented and of great public discussion is the war on drugs and the prison industrial complex. The war on drugs was infamously enacted by President Richard Nixon in 1971 and is now considered by many to have been created with malicious racial intent. In her book, The New Jim Crow, Michelle Alexander retraces this history as one that rested upon coded rhetoric, a conflation of race and criminality, and discriminatory practices like disparities in drug sentencing, stop and frisk, and the three strikes law. As we know, this war and subsequent mass incarceration continue to threaten and target the lives of poor, black and brown people. White violence towards black economic development wasn't limited to market centers in urban areas. Along with displacement of blacks from the communities they built, the United States also has a history of more physical mass violence towards black entrepreneurs. Some blacks in Atlanta inherited land from the slave owners that they'd labored under for free for their entire lives. Others had purchased their freedom and invested in purchasing their own land. Either way, for those blacks that were able to secure land for growing their own crops, were heavily exploited by competing white landowners. In response to the discrimination that black landowners were facing, native farmer Robert Hill established the Progressive Farmers and Household Union of America, a sharecroppers union to support black farmers suffering from racism and discrimination negatively affecting their business. White elites' economic prosperity in the area depended on the exploitation of the black farmers by keeping them in constant debt. The union advocated for black farmers having control over their own earnings. White elites often settled ever-growing debts by seizing all of the black landowners' possessions, forcing them out of business. As blacks began to unite against this practice and seek independence in the agricultural industry, white elites sought to destroy the sharecroppers union. The elites reported the death of a white landowner to the sheriff, who assembled a large white militia that went after the black sharecroppers, and as a result, 237 black people who'd been seeking compensation for the crops they harvested were killed that day. No one was ever charged for the mass lynching of 1919. These black farmers were all land-owning entrepreneurs whose wealth failed to transfer to the next generation because of the horrendous violence that occurred. For those that actually believe that black people have little to show in wealth for our time here, they fail to recognize the hundreds of landowners that were killed as a result for advocating to be paid equally and treated fairly in business. Throughout history, white Americans have been very intentional about disrupting black cooperative development and destroying black-owned businesses. The basis for all of these crimes against society was to reassert white supremacy and put blacks in their place, who attempted to seek economic liberation for themselves. For those who continue to believe the false idea that blacks have been lazy during their time in the United States, let this be evidence that blacks continually work hard to rebuild, though they have yet to ever be compensated for the countless attempts at destroying their economic progress. In an attempt to right the wrongs that have been committed against black economic development, the government should provide grants to black people looking to buy property in areas close to their homes. They should be enabled to rebuild the communities that they were pushed out of. For as long as the government refuses to do so, they've failed at any attempt to repair the damage caused by institutional racism. In the United States, there's a political battle raging over the concept of systemic racism. One side claims that if racism exists at all, it's isolated to individuals and one-off incidents, while the other side argues racism is woven into the fabric of the country's systems. Who's right? One can find evidence of systemic racism by taking a close look at areas of society like education, employment, housing, healthcare, the criminal justice system, and immigration policy. On the surface, a single stat may have more than one explanation, but taken all together, the data paints a clear picture. Someone's race affects things like their education, how much money they earn, where they can live, what they eat, and the kind of medical care they receive. Policies and power structures rooted in white privilege maintain institutional racism, also known as systemic racism. From healthcare to housing to education to employment, institutional racism is everywhere. Nance Schick, an attorney and mediator based in New York, told Health,
"In the United States, institutional racism has presented itself more subtly in recent years than in the past. What was once overt discrimination is now more covert and often hidden until someone speaks up. Legal segregation and Jim Crow laws previously publicly encoded institutional racism across the country. In contrast, today, clear policies and signage do not frequently identify institutional racism. However, biases in favor of white people still exist in coded forms. Declaring certain hairstyles unprofessional historically restricted qualified black candidates from gainful employment. Despite the Crown Act of 2020, which prohibits discrimination based on hair texture or style, there are still employers who have restrictions on hair, particularly dreadlocks and natural hair. Often, those restrictions have an unfair outcome in black communities.
Institutional racism is prevalent in the United States across just about every sector.
Demleitner, president of St. John's College's Annapolis campus and researcher specializing in criminal justice and higher education, told Health, "The impact of institutional racism is far-reaching, a vicious cycle that takes a toll on individuals and society. Here's an overview of the historically prevalent discrimination that affects the black community. In many ways, access to education lays the foundation for the rest of a person's life. Without a good education, a person's employment opportunities and income potential are limited. This has a ripple effect on every area of their life and their children's lives. According to 2013 to 2014 data from the U.S. Department of Education's Office of Civil Rights, black K-12 students are almost 4 times more likely than white students to get 1 or more out-of-school suspensions. Black girls in particular face discrimination. They are 5.5 times more likely to be suspended compared to white girls, while Native American girls are 3.3 times more likely to face suspension. Systemic racism affects education quality as well. School districts with the most black, Native, and Latino students get significantly less revenue than districts with fewer students of color. For districts with 5,000 students, that can mean losing $13.5 million. School funding, based on property values and residential taxes, combined with racial segregation in housing, led to systemic underfunding of predominantly black schools. Less funding means fewer computers, fewer teachers, outdated textbooks, and rundown buildings. Even in schools with resources like gifted education programs, racial disparities are a problem. In one study, after adjusting for factors like standardized test scores, researchers found black students were 54% less likely to be referred to gifted education programs. In contrast, primarily, white low-poverty districts spend almost $2,000 more per student than low-poverty districts where most students are people of color. That results in poor test scores and learning outcomes for black students at underfunded schools. The racial disparity in incarceration rates has continuously worsened. The rate for African Americans has tripled between 1968 and 2016 and is more than 6 times the rate of white incarceration. These racial disparities are no accident. Black and brown people are at far greater risk of being targeted, profiled, and arrested for minor offenses, especially in high-poverty areas. The implications of overcriminalization are far-reaching. A criminal history can keep people from successfully passing background checks to secure both housing and employment. People exiting jails and prisons often face significant problems in accessing safe and affordable housing, and their rate of homelessness is high. According to the American Academy of Family Physicians, the U.S. healthcare system has historically discriminated against non-white populations. Many healthcare facilities throughout the country that predominantly serve black communities lack the funding, resources, and staff to deliver adequate healthcare. Often, poor healthcare services lead to adverse health outcomes. In fact, in the United States, black women are as much as 4 times more likely than white women to experience a pregnancy-related death. Research has found that, in addition to healthcare providers' racial biases, inadequate access to prenatal healthcare raises the risk of maternal mortality. Almost 7 million people in the United States live with Alzheimer's disease, but the burden of that diagnosis is not carried equally among the racial groups that make up this country. Black people carry the highest risk of developing dementia, followed by Indigenous Americans and people of Hispanic and Latino descent. Despite this increased risk, these groups are often underrepresented in research and clinical trials and are more likely to face barriers to accessing quality care and basic resources like healthy foods and clean air. The underlying risk factors of dementia, hypertension, diabetes, air pollution, poor nutrition, and lack of physical activity all have a connection to the inequalities experienced by communities of color and people with lower incomes. Also, the COVID-19 pandemic highlighted inequities in the U.S. healthcare system. According to one study published in 2022 in Health Affairs, poor COVID-19 outcomes among non-white populations directly result from racist U.S. healthcare policies. Systemic racism's effect on employment is well documented. It begins with the hiring process. Black Americans with white-sounding names receive 50% more callbacks for their job applications. Having a college degree doesn't necessarily help one's chances. Between 2010 to 2012, one study showed that while only 6% of all engineering graduates were unemployed, 10% of black college graduates with engineering degrees didn't have jobs. Despite these numbers, is getting a degree still worth it? Studies show that while white college-educated households enjoy higher lifetime earnings and better economic achievements, this doesn't apply to black college-educated households. White college graduates are much more likely to get and give financial support for education and home ownership from their parents, while black college graduates are more likely to be the ones supporting their parents. What about income? Workplaces still discriminate against people of color, especially women. While white women earn about 79 cents for every white man's dollar, black women earn 63 cents, while Hispanic Latino women earn 58 cents. Black men earn about 71 cents per dollar. According to a city report, the black pay gap alone equals about $2.7 trillion. All that lost income leads to higher rates of poverty within non-white communities. According to census data from 2019, black and Hispanic Americans were overrepresented in poverty. When it comes to housing in the United States, institutional racism has profound effects on black communities. Systemic racism in housing has a long history. The National Housing Act of 1934 formalized redlining, which effectively restricted people of color from home ownership. Instead of getting to live in the newly established suburbs, black Americans and other people of color were segregated into urban housing projects. The government was not subtle. According to the Federal Housing Administration's reasoning, if black Americans bought suburban homes, the property values would go down and threaten the loans of white Americans. There was no evidence of this. The Federal Housing Authority's justification was based in racism. Beth Beatriz, PhD, researcher in health equity, told Health,
Despite redlining being outlawed over 50 years ago, we continue to feel that impact today in so many ways. In 2020, Black Americans were over 40% less likely to own their homes compared to white Americans. This greatly impacts how families accumulate wealth. In 2017, the Urban Institute reported the home ownership rate for white households was 71.9%. In contrast, the rate for Black households was 41.8%.
Marsha Parham Green, the executive director of the Baltimore County Office of Housing, told Health
that racial residential segregation is the cornerstone of Black and white disparities. The inequities built into low-income housing is a fundamental cause of health disparities between Black and white people. Concentrated poverty, safety, and segregation, as well as other social and community attributes, further contribute to stress and deterioration of health. Those who are most vulnerable, children and the elderly, are most adversely affected by unstable housing conditions.
Food insecurity refers to a lack of access to adequate food. That could include a lack of grocery stores nearby, or a lack of stores with high-quality, affordable food. In the United States, areas affected by food insecurity are often called food deserts. They are part of many low-income urban neighborhoods. In 2014, a professor found that while poverty was a key component, Black and Hispanic neighborhoods had fewer large supermarkets than their white counterparts. Further research confirms the link between race and food insecurity. Using data from 2021, Feeding America found that while the Black population represents just 14% of the country's population, it has a food insecurity rate of 19.7%. The Native population, which represents 1.9% of the population, has a food insecurity rate of 20%. Food insecurity has many consequences on a community's health and well-being. When the only options for food are places like gas stations, dollar stores, and fast food restaurants, the risk for serious health conditions like heart disease, diabetes, and birth defects increases. Children without good nutrition may experience delayed development, asthma, anemia, and behavioral issues. Systemic racism is behind the prevalence of food deserts. Since the 1980s, premium grocery stores have prioritized white, wealthier customers in the suburbs while divesting from Black communities in cities. To this day, stereotypes about crime and poverty, both of which are highly racialized, have made supermarkets resistant to expansion. Black people are roughly 5 times as likely as white people to report being unfairly stopped by the police. Black Americans are also more likely to suffer the ill effects of racial profiling. Racial profiling is stereotyping a person based on assumed characteristics of a racial or ethnic group rather than the individual. Police brutality is an ongoing problem in the United States, disproportionately affecting Black communities. As a result of police brutality, Black people face an adverse risk of poor health outcomes, like 1. Death from injuries sustained by the police. 2. Health complications that increase the risk of death. 3. Stress. 4. Unfair arrest and incarceration. Economically based discrimination goes hand in hand with interpersonal racism. For example, business loan officers may require Black applicants to have higher credit scores and income levels than white applicants. If that discrimination is widespread in finance, it may become an example of institutional racism. Also, a 2018 investigation by the National Fair Housing Alliance, a Washington-based nonprofit, found economic discrimination regarding car loans. According to the results, on average, non-white applicants who experienced discrimination would have paid an average of $2,662.56 more over the life of the loan than less qualified white applicants. The investigators also found that 75% of the time, white applicants were offered more financing options than non-white applicants. Some state elected officials denied early and mail-in voting. During the 2020 U.S. general election in North Carolina, black voters' ballots were rejected at more than 3 times the rate of white voters. Also, in August 2020, the U.S. Postal Service removed hundreds of sorting machines, a form of institutional racism. Lauren Racer, an attorney and founder of the Mount Vernon Coalition for Police Reform, told Health.
Mail delivery was slowed down, and residents over-indexing with a black population couldn't get their mail,
said Racer. Another form of institutional racism in politics is gerrymandering. Gerrymandering determines electoral districts, which decide the outcomes of state and federal elections. For example, there is one U.S. representative from each district. Census data, which the U.S. government collects every 10 years, influences redistricting. Racial gerrymandering happens when people in positions of power redraw district lines to suppress minority voices. Take, for example, a community largely made up of black voters. However, if lawmakers gerrymander that community into several districts, the likelihood of black voters being accurately represented decreases. Institutional racism is pervasive and can affect every aspect of people's lives, from their finances to their education and physical and mental health. Institutional racism is not as obvious as in previous generations, but it affects people of color profoundly. For example, institutional racism may be as subtle as a lack of spending on public schools in economically disadvantaged areas serving minorities. The best way to fight institutional racism is to become aware and active in changing the policies and behaviors perpetuating it, from creating fair hiring and recruitment guidelines to working with minority-owned businesses to changing government funds. Finding ways to reimagine policies is key. The goal is that those policies don't target black people more than white people. Institutional racism hurts society, squashing innovation and creating an environment that breeds unhealthy stress and burnout. If institutional racism continues as the status quo, those affected will continue to be a part of a cycle of despair and disenfranchisement.
Black Americans who call out institutional racism are often gaslighted.
LaShawn Paul, mental health expert and diversity and inclusion strategist, told Health.
But to address any problem, you must first acknowledge its existence. Silence is complacency.
According to Schick, in the United States, people can combat institutional racism by making the following changes.
Don't stop with one black friend and think you know enough about the black experience. One person does not represent an entire group of people. Go to town halls, school board meetings, and other places people are discussing solutions. Protests and books are great for creating awareness. But then, it's time for solutions at every level. Speak up when you see changes that can be made. Sometimes, the change is in a policy. Other times, change is as small as an individual's behavior. It's getting harder for all of us to claim ignorance. It's time to make a change.
Schick continues.
And perhaps that is where it begins, with pure intention. Adding courage and action, big changes can occur. But we likely have to do some deep soul-searching first and accept that it will be uncomfortable. Nevertheless, this is where we must begin. Again.
Thank you for watching.